crowd inside the Old Sands Ballroom was the kind of crowd that only existed when legends walked into a room. A low electric hum of perfume, cigarette smoke, polished shoes, and anticipation swirling together beneath chandeliers that had seen 1,000 nights of applause, but none quite like this one. Dean Martin stood just off stage, smoothing the front of his jacket with easy charm. The corners of his mouth curved in that familiar half-smile the world knew so well. Yet behind his eyes lived a fatigue no spotlight ever reached. A weight that had nothing to do with fame and everything to do with the quiet hours after it. Across from him, Sammy Davis Jr. bounced lightly on his heels, snapping his fingers to a rhythm only he could hear, energy coiled inside him like a spring. Eyes alive, alert, always watching, always absorbing. They were set to close the night with something playful, something loose, a dance number meant to feel improvised. Two friends teasing the music, laughing through the steps. The kind of performance that made audiences feel like they were witnessing a private joke rather than a rehearsed routine. The orchestra began to warm the air with brass and piano, the curtain lifting slowly, the room leaning forward as if pulled by invisible strings. And when Dean and Sammy stepped into the light together, the applause hit them like a wave. Warm and roaring, and full of expectation. Dean moved first. That smooth, unhurried confidence in every step, as though the music existed solely to follow him, while Sammy circled him playfully, feet tapping faster, shoulders bouncing, a grin spreading wide across his face as he punctuated the rhythm with quick turns and claps. They traded gestures, mock bows, exaggerated spins, the audience laughing, the band swelling behind them, and for a few shining moments, it felt like nothing in the world existed beyond the wooden floor beneath. Their shoes and the shared pulse of sound and laughter. Then it happened so subtly at first that even Dean himself didn't quite understand it. A misstep. A breath taken a fraction too late. The briefest flicker of disorientation behind his eyes. His foot slid where it shouldn't have. The smooth arc of his movement fractured. And suddenly, the world tilted. The sound of Dean Martin hitting the stage was not loud, but it was heavy. A dull, unmistakable thud that sliced through the music like a blade. The orchestra faltered. A few instruments died mid-note. Gasps rippled through the crowd, sharp and collective, as if the entire room had inhaled at once. Dean lay on the floor, one hand braced awkwardly against the stage, the other pressed to his side, his face pale, not with drama, but with genuine shock. For a split second, it was confusion, the kind performers sometimes script into their routines, and a few people even laughed uncertainly, waiting for the wink, the punchline, the familiar smirk that never came. Sammy didn't hesitate. He didn't look to the wings. He didn't search the crowd. He didn't play it off. He dropped. Not gracefully. Not theatrically. He dropped to his knees beside Dean so fast his own shoes skidded across the stage, one hand immediately behind Dean's shoulders, the other bracing his back, his voice low, urgent. Completely stripped of performance? Easy, brother. Don't move. I've got you. The microphone still hung in his hand, but he wasn't speaking to the audience anymore. He was speaking to a man. Dean tried to laugh, tried to lift his head, but the effort drew a sharp breath from his chest, his body refusing the familiar language of charm it had spoken for decades. The crowd was silent now. No rustle, no coughs. Only the faint hum of stage lights and the distant clink of a glass somewhere in the darkness. Sammy shifted closer, blocking the glare, his own body becoming a shield between Dean and 1,000 watching eyes. He slipped an arm around him. Not to lift him, not yet, but to steady him. To let him know he wasn't alone on that floor. Not in front of anyone, not ever. "Hey," Sammy murmured. So softly the microphones barely caught it. "Look at me. That's it. Breathe. I'm right here." In that moment, the show was gone. The spotlight didn't matter. The audience didn't matter. Even the music didn't matter. What mattered was that Dean's hand tightened around Sammy's sleeve, knuckles whitening not from pain alone but from the shock of vulnerability. The unfamiliar position of being seen not as a star, but as a man who had fallen. Sammy felt it instantly, that subtle tremor and something fierce and protective rose in his chest. Something deeper than friendship, deeper than showmanship, something rooted in recognition. He knew what it was to stand under lights and feel invincible. He also knew what it was to have those lights suddenly reveal how fragile a body could be. He turned his head slightly toward the orchestra pit and shook it once. Firm, clear, the band fell silent. Then, without standing, without breaking his hold, Sammy lifted the microphone again, not with a performer's flourish, but with a friend's steadiness. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice calm but full, "we're going to take a pause right here. My brother took a little fall, and we're going to make sure he's all right. That's the most important thing tonight." There was no panic in his tone, no drama, only certainty. Stagehands began to move from the wings, hesitant at first, unsure whether they were interrupting a bit or entering a real moment. Till one look at Sammy's face erased all doubt. He stayed where he was as they approached, one hand still firm at Dean's back, his body angled protectively, refusing to let the moment turn into spectacle. Dean's breathing slowly evened, his eyes closing for a second, as if the simple fact of being held steady had anchored something inside him that had begun to drift. Later, many would remember that night as the night Dean Martin fell. But the truth, the real beginning, was not in the fall. It was in what followed, because while the crowd would eventually applaud again, while the headlines would soften the moment into a story, while the lights would dim and the orchestra would pack away their instruments, something invisible and irreversible had already taken shape on that stage. In the quiet space between breaths, in the grip of a hand on a sleeve, in the way Sammy Davis Jr. stayed down on that floor long after the performance had ended, refusing to rush the man beside him back into the armor of applause, and in that stillness, a bond began to form that would outlast spotlights, outlast stages, outlast decades, a bond not born from laughter, but from the simple, powerful decision to stay. The applause eventually returned, hesitant at first, then swelling as stagehands carefully helped Dean Martin to his feet and guided him slowly toward the wings. The crowd standing not because they were entertained, but because something human had passed between them and they felt compelled to honor it. Sammy walked beside him the entire way, one hand never leaving Dean's back, his body angled protectively as if the lights themselves might still demand something Dean no longer had to give. Behind the curtain, the music vanished completely, replaced by the muffled murmur of the audience and the low urgency of backstage voices, but even that noise seemed distant, as though the fall had knocked Dean into a quieter world where every sensation felt heavier and more precise. A chair was brought, then another. Someone offered water. Someone else spoke about doctors, about cars waiting out back, about whether the press had already begun asking questions. None of it registered at first. Dean sat with his head bowed, one hand pressed into his side, his other hanging loose between his knees, his breath slow but uneven, his mind still replaying the instant. His body had betrayed him in front of hundreds. Sammy crouched in front of him instead of taking a seat. He lowered himself until he was eye level, forcing Dean to look at him, not at the floor, not at the crowd he could no longer see but still felt. "Talk to me," he said quietly, the words not a command but an invitation. Dean tried to shrug it off with humor, that old reflex rising automatically, but the sound that came out wasn't laughter. It was thin, incomplete. "Guess I don't dance like I used to," he murmured. The sentence was meant to float. Instead, it sank. Sammy heard what Dean hadn't said, the years in that space, the fear that time was finally collecting its debt, the unspoken thought that maybe the world would now start watching him, not for his ease, but for his limits. Sammy didn't answer right away. He reached out and placed two fingers lightly at Dean's wrist, feeling the pulse there, steady but fast, real, grounding. "You don't have to dance like you used to," he said finally. "You just have to be here. And you are." Those words landed harder than applause ever could. Dean closed his eyes for a moment, not because of pain, but because something behind them had tightened. All his life he had been the one who steadied rooms, who smoothed edges, who made difficulty disappear beneath charm. Sitting there now, costume rumpled, jacket open, breath still uneven. He felt exposed in a way no spotlight had ever achieved. It was one thing to perform vulnerability. It was another to be seen inside it. And yet in front of him was Sammy, not staring past him, not rushing him forward, not treating the moment as a problem to be managed, but as a person to be met. The stage manager returned, voice careful, explaining that the night would end early, that statements could be made, that transportation was ready. Sammy didn't look up. "Give us a minute," he said, not sharply, but firmly enough that the man nodded and stepped back. When the door finally closed and the room thinned, the silence that remained was thick, almost audible. Dean shifted slightly, wincing, then exhaling through his teeth. "You know," he said, eyes still down, "I've been doing this so long I forgot what it feels like when the music stops and there's nothing to hide behind." Sammy leaned back against a makeup table, studying him. "I never forgot," he replied. "They just don't always let me show it." There was no bitterness in his voice, only truth. Dean looked up then, really looked, as if seeing not just the performer who could light up a stage, but the man who had learned early how quickly applause could change its mind. "You didn't have to do what you did out there," Dean said. "You could have played it, turned it into something funny. They would have laughed." Sammy shook his head. "They would have laughed. And you would have been alone. I wasn't going to do that to you." Knock interrupted them. A doctor this time, polite, professional, checking Dean's side, asking questions, shining a small light into his eyes. Sammy stayed. Not looming, not interfering, just present. When Dean stood, testing his weight, Sammy was already there, ready, his arm offered not as spectacle, but as support. They moved slowly down the narrow corridor, past faded posters and open crates, past the forgotten architecture of entertainment, until they reached a quiet room meant for storage that now held only a small couch and the faint smell of dust. Dean sat again, heavier this time, exhaustion finally catching him. Sammy poured water and held the glass while he drank, the gesture so simple and unremarkable that it became profound. Minutes stretched. Then more. Outside engines started. Somewhere down the hall, laughter flared, then died. The sound of people who had not been on that stage were already returning to their versions of the night. Inside the small room, something different unfolded. Dean spoke about how lately the mornings felt slower, how sometimes the mirror surprised him, how he still heard the old songs in his head but didn't always trust the body that carried them. Sammy listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't correct. He let the words come. When Dean stopped, expecting perhaps reassurance, perhaps jokes, Sammy instead told him a story of his own, of being young and electric and convinced he could outdance gravity itself, of discovering over time that talent didn't protect anyone from the quieter battles, the ones fought away from microphones. "The stage teaches you how to shine," Sammy said, "but it doesn't teach you how to fall. We're supposed to teach each other that part." It was a small sentence, but it shifted something. Because in that room, long after the audience had dispersed and the headlines had already begun drafting themselves, two men who had shared stages but rarely shared stillness found themselves in new territory. Not rivals, not co-stars, not members of some glittering circle the world had named for them. Just two people sitting with the aftershock of a moment neither had planned. Dean leaned back, eyes tracing the ceiling, then said quietly, "You stayed." Sammy didn't answer at first. He picked at a loose thread on his cuff, then looked up. "Yeah," he said, "and I will again." The words were not dramatic. They weren't framed as promises, but they settled between them like something solid, because neither of them knew it yet. But that night was not ending. It was opening. The fall on that stage had cracked something neither applause nor success could reach, and through that fracture, a different kind of connection was beginning to take shape. One built not on how brightly they could stand in front of people, but on how they would stand beside each other when the music was gone, and in the quiet behind the curtain, where no one was watching anymore, the first true steps of a long friendship were being taken. When the world tried to name them, the days after the fall unfolded in a way neither Dean Martin nor Sammy Davis Jr. had anticipated. Not with silence, but with noise, the restless. Searching noise of a world that could not simply let a human moment remain human. Newspapers softened the incident into humor, some calling it a slip, others shaping it into a punchline, a few sharpening it into something colder, something about age, relevance, decline. Radio hosts joked. Columnists speculated. Strangers who had never stood under those lights began speaking with confidence about what the moment meant. And everywhere Dean turned, he felt it, not concern, not curiosity, but interpretation. As if the fall were no longer his, as if it had become a symbol that belonged to anyone who needed it to tell a story. He stopped reading, stopped listening. He told people he was fine. He smiled when they asked, but alone, the quiet grew heavy. The house he had once filled with music and company now seemed to echo even when he was not moving. Every creak of the floor, a reminder that bodies kept their own time. Whether fame approved or not, Sammy, meanwhile, saw the shift immediately. Not just in the headlines, but in the rooms. Conversations paused when Dean entered. Compliments came dressed as reassurance. Invitations softened. The industry did not announce its doubts. It never did. It simply began to angle them. Sammy had spent his life learning to read that angle the way a compliment could quietly become a question, the way an opportunity could quietly become a test. And now, those same subtle adjustments were brushing against. Dean, a talk show appearance suggested instead of a live performance. A dance number trimmed to a walk. A suggestion to sit for this one. None of it cruel. All of it clear. Dean felt it too. He did not speak of it. But Sammy noticed the pauses before he stood. The way his hands sometimes hovered near furniture. The way humor arrived a second earlier than usual, as if to outrun something. And one evening, weeks after the fall, Sammy showed up at Dean's door unannounced, carrying nothing but a jacket over his shoulder and a look that did not ask permission. Dean blinked in surprise, then stepped aside. They sat in the living room without turning on the radio. The city hummed faintly through the windows. Dean poured 2 drinks, then hesitated, adjusting the glasses, the smallest pause betraying the storm beneath. Sammy waited. Finally, Dean exhaled and said, "They're changing the way they look at me." It was not anger in his voice. It was recognition. Sammy nodded. "Yeah, they do that. They call it concern." Dean laughed once, quietly. "I built my life on making rooms lighter," he said. "I don't know who I am when I'm the heavy thing in them." Sammy leaned forward. "You're the same man who stood there and sang when no one knew his name. You're the same man who carried other people's bad nights without letting them see. Falling didn't make you heavier. It just made you visible." That was the night Sammy proposed something reckless. Not a charity appearance. Not a safe venue. A small club. Tight stage. Live band. No edits. No cutaways. Just movement, music, and proximity. "They think the fall is the story now," Sammy said. "Let's give them a better one." Dean studied him, seeing not bravado, but intention. "What if I can't?" he asked. Sammy didn't answer quickly. "Then we'll find out together," he said. "On our feet, not in whispers." The club was wrong in every way. Too intimate. Too close. No place to hide. When they stepped inside days later, Dean felt the old electricity flicker, followed by the unfamiliar companion of doubt. Faces turned. Murmurs passed. The stage seemed smaller than he remembered. The lights harsher. Sammy noticed his hesitation and said nothing. He simply walked beside him. The band tuned. The room filled. When their names were announced, the applause came, warm, real, but threaded with something else, something searching. They started slow. Dean sang first. Not the big notes. Not the polished ease. Just voice. Just presence. And it held. Then the rhythm shifted. Sammy stepped forward, tapping, clapping, letting the beat grow. He turned toward Dean and offered his hand, not as a gesture to the crowd, but to him. For a moment, Dean did not take it. The room waited. He could hear his own breath. He could feel the memory of the floor beneath him, the suddenness, the helplessness. Then he placed his hand in Sammy's. They did not dance to impress. They moved to test. Simple steps. Shared rhythm? No tricks, no leaps, just motion. The music carried them. Dean's foot slid, corrected. His body followed. His shoulders loosened. The old ease did not rush back. It rebuilt, one beat at a time. The crowd began to respond, not with roar, but with something rarer, attention. The kind that does not consume, but witnesses. And as the number ended, the applause rose. Not because something flashy had been done, but because something honest had been seen. Backstage afterward, Dean sat, breath fast, eyes bright. "I was afraid," he said quietly. Sammy smiled, not triumphant, but proud. "Good," he replied. "That means you were alive in it." From that night on, something changed. Not in the industry it would always calculate, but between them. They did not need headlines. They did not need framing. They had stood in a room that wanted a verdict and offered a moment instead. And yet, even as their bond strengthened, something heavier gathered beyond the lights. Because when men choose loyalty over convenience, when they refuse to be shaped by the easy stories, the world rarely stays passive. It watches, it waits, and it prepares its next test. The call came late, the kind that arrives when the world has gone quiet enough for fear to sound louder than it should. Sammy was alone, running through steps that no longer belonged to any stage, only to his own memory. When the phone rang, and a familiar voice on the other end hesitated before speaking, as if choosing the wrong words might fracture something already fragile. Dean had been offered a solo television special, a major one, the kind networks reserved for moments they wanted to frame forever. And the proposal had come wrapped in compliments, in legacy talk, in the language of celebration, but beneath it ran a current neither of them missed. The producers wanted elegance, stillness, a chair placed carefully at center stage, songs delivered without movement. "They think it's kinder," Dean said, though the word sounded foreign in his mouth. "They think they're protecting me." Sammy closed his eyes. He could see the set already, could hear the polite applause, could feel the quiet decision being made for a man who had once filled rooms by walking through them. "What do you want?" he asked. There was a long pause. "Then honestly, I don't want to be protected. I want to be present." The next meeting was held in a glass-walled office that reflected faces back at themselves until it was impossible to tell where the room ended and image began. Executives spoke carefully, as if sound itself were fragile. They praised Dean's career. They praised his influence. They praised his endurance. Then they outlined their vision, a seated performance. Warm lighting, archival footage, a tone of gentle farewell disguised as tribute. When Sammy spoke, it was not loud. It was steady. "That's not a tribute," he said. "That's a conclusion." A few smiles tightened. A few hands folded. They explained risks. They spoke about optics. They mentioned sponsors. They said the word fall without saying it. Dean listened. Then he stood. It was not dramatic, but it was deliberate. "I didn't come back to be displayed," he said. "I came back to participate." The room shifted. Someone suggested compromise. A short opening number. Minimal movement. Sammy stepped forward. "If he's opening, he's not opening alone," he said. The air cooled. This was not what had been planned. They wanted the story clean, singular, contained. Two men complicated the frame. They exchanged glances. Calculations happened behind eyes. Finally, one of them asked, "Are you saying you won't do it otherwise?" Sammy looked at Dean before answering. Dean nodded once. "We're saying we won't," Sammy replied. What followed was not immediate. There were calls, pauses, rumors, suggestions that the special might be postponed, reshaped, quietly redirected. Dean felt the old unease stir, the whisper that perhaps this was how it narrowed. How rooms slowly closed their doors while smiling. One afternoon, he voiced it. "You don't have to tie yourself to this," he said. "They'll never say it out loud, but they'll remember who complicated it." Sammy didn't answer right away. He took a breath, slow, considered. "They've been remembering things about me my whole life," he said. "None of them ever made me smaller unless I agreed to them." The final decision came a week later. The special would go on. Not as a farewell. As a collaboration. Live band. Shared stage. Open floor. No chair. Rehearsals began in a cavernous studio that swallowed sound until only intention remained. Dean's body argued some mornings. There were days he moved carefully, days he rested more than he wanted. Sammy never pushed. He matched. They rebuilt the performance not around what Dean used to do, but around what they could do together. Interplay, timing, call, and response. Moments where movement became conversation instead of exhibition. And slowly, something unexpected happened. Dean stopped measuring himself against his past. He began measuring the present, against breath, against music, against the simple fact of standing beside someone who was not keeping score. The night of the broadcast arrived with a weight that had nothing to do with ratings. The studio lights were brighter than club lights. The audience larger, the cameras unblinking. Dean stood just off stage, listening to the low murmur of hundreds. The soft directives in headsets, the distant tuning of instruments. His reflection stared back at him from a dark monitor. Older, yes, but clearer. Sammy joined him, adjusting his cuffs, then met his eyes. "You ready?" he asked. Dean smiled. "Not the practiced one. The real one." "I am if you are." Sammy grinned. "Always." They walked out together, not introduced separately, not framed. Together, the first number was gentle. Voice first, then rhythm. The second grew warmer. By the third, something in the room had changed. Not excitement. Recognition. They were not watching preservation. They were watching participation. And when the final piece arrived, the one they had built around shared movement, shared timing, shared space, Dean stepped forward without thinking. His foot found the beat. His shoulders followed. Sammy mirrored him. They turned, crossed, returned. No tricks. No declarations. Just motion and music and the visible. Truth of two men choosing presence over permission. The applause did not begin when the song ended. It rose during it. Backstage afterward, Dean sat, hand on his chest, breath deep, eyes bright with something that felt like relief. "I forgot," he said quietly, "that courage doesn't feel like confidence. It feels like showing up before it arrives." Sammy sat beside him. "That's why you don't do it alone," he replied. Years later, people would speak of that fall as the beginning. They would point to that night as the moment something changed. But those who had been closest knew the truth. The fall did not build the friendship. What built it were the decisions that followed to kneel instead of perform, to stand instead of retreat, to share instead of separate, to choose the harder path because it left room for someone else. 33. Years is a long time, long enough for stages to change, for lights to fade, for eras to pass, but not long enough to outlive a moment when one man fell, and another decided that staying mattered more than shining, and that choice quiet, untelevised. Unrepeatable became the foundation of everything that came after. Not a headline, a bond.